Good afternoon. I'm Ellen Keith, the Executive Director of Chicago Collections Consortium, and I am delighted to have Will Quam here today, Brick of Chicago and author of Fire and Clay. We're going to give Will time to talk and then some questions at the end. I'll just do a little intro. I just want to share Chicago Collections Consortium land acknowledgement. Chicago Collections Consortium acknowledges and is grateful for the Native peoples who laid the foundation for the city of Chicago and for the diverse indigenous nations that reside in Chicago today. When you visit our member organizations and when you experience Chicago's outdoor spaces, we invite you to join in offering respect and gratitude to the many indigenous peoples that reside in the Chicagoland region, as well as their ancestors. I encourage you to search our Explore Chicago Collections portal for any of our members' collections on any single Chicago wonderful topic. Check out our events. We've got some upcoming events where we've partnered with CPL. We are very grateful for our supporters, DK Mellon, Tara, Donnelly, Illinois Arts Council, Wintrust, and the Driehaus Foundation. And now I am delighted to stop talking and turn this over to Will.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. I take advantage of the consortium collections all the time in my research. A little background on me. I'm an architecture photographer and historian and tour guide. And that's basically my resume right there, that quote at the bottom. I don't really need to have much else than Jeffrey Bear's endorsement. But we're going to talk about brick today. My new book, Fire and Clay, looks into the history of brick architecture in Chicago and brick as a design material in Chicago. You know, not just as a material that's used to build, but a material that has been used to decorate and inspire across generations. All right, so we'll go to the next slide. So when you see a brick building in Chicago, usually it looks something like this. And you'll notice on this building, like most in Chicago, it has two different kinds of brick on it. It's got one kind of brick on the very front there, on the right of your screen, but most of the building is made up of something totally different. That's because when we talk about brick, there's two categories of brick. There's face brick and common brick. Face brick is that little slice on the front. Face brick faces the street, it's chosen, it's selected, it's expensive, it's there to impress your neighbors. Common brick is all the rest that you see. It's just doing a job. It's filling up the building, it's giving it structure. And what makes Chicago such a unique brick city, such an interesting place to see how brick has evolved as a decorative material, is that we only made common brick. That's all the kind of brick we made in Chicago, just the cheap building stuff. So all the face brick, all the nice stuff on the front of our buildings was imported from somewhere else, places that had clays that produced a lot more predictable material. And if we go to the next slide, you can see on the left there a close-up of the building we were just looking, where you have that Chicago common brick with a little slice of face brick on the front. And you can see the Chicago common brick is just so full of stones and pebbles, and it's stained black by soot. And it's this nature of the common brick, this really messy appearance that made it to be considered, in fact, the ugliest brick in the entire world by Chicago architects. They, in fact, it was hated across the country. A Boston brickmaker in 1892 said in a speech that if Adam from the Bible had been a brickmaker, he would have caused the fall of man by making a brick as ugly as those they make in Chicago. So it was ugly, but it was cheap. $10 only to buy 1,000 of them. So that's mostly what we used. But compare it in the picture on the left there, that's or the right, a picture I took in Philadelphia, where that is Philadelphia face brick on the front, Philadelphia common brick on the side. It doesn't look that different. Philadelphia's clays were so consistent and beautiful, while looking back at the left, Chicago clays were just so full of junk. So we had to import other stuff. Next slide. So that's why most of our buildings look like they do. You've got one layer of brick, that face brick on the front of the building, but because that face brick could cost you $15, $30, $70 to buy 1,000 of them, most of the building is filled up with that cheap common brick. Only the very front layer is the more expensive face brick. Next slide. So the reason we were able to make such cheap brick in an enormous volume. By 1916, Chicago was producing 11% of all the brick in the United States, and it was all that cheap, ugly Chicago brick. It's because 14,000 years ago, this is what Chicago looked like. It was an enormous glacial lake covering the entirety of Chicago with this huge lake bed. And the still water of the lake allowed the finest particulate clay to settle down all across the lake bed. And when it eventually receded to create Lake Michigan, all the clay was still there in places where if you clear away the topsoil, you could scoop it up and start making it into bricks. And that's what people did. Next slide. And a lot of the earliest clay manufacturing and brick making in Chicago looks like the map on the far left there. That's a fire insurance map from 1897. Three small companies there with an inset with a fourth, working three small pits. But as the industry mechanized even more, they were able to start using much larger pits. And a lot of these small companies made a giant conglomerate called the Illinois Brick Company, which is what you see in the middle section there, working the clay, digging this huge hole out of the ground with these big steam shovels like you see. But by 1915, this big clay pit on the north side, they used up all the easy to get clay. The Illinois Brick Company moved down south, mostly to Blue Island. They're left with a big hole in the ground. They filled it in with trash as a dump. Eventually, the neighbors complain. The city takes it over in 1929. They pave it. Next slide. And they built Lane Tech High School on top of it. And that's true all across the city of Chicago. These clay pits filled in and repurposed for rentals, for schools, for towers, for parks and golf courses, and anything you could possibly ever want. Next slide. But brick, as I mentioned, it's a design material. So what did people use brick for? How did they decorate it throughout Chicago's history? Well, the earliest days, not a lot. This is the Lake House Hotel from 1836, considered one of the nicest hotels in Chicago when it was built. And it's built using that cheap local brick. And at this time, too, the bricks were all handmade. And so they were incredibly messy. And so brick became this material that you would use to enclose your structure, but all the decoration would be from wood, that cupola up top or the projecting cornice. And then the interior was really the big thing. Next slide. The lake house is gone, but this is the Growy Mill from 20 years later, 1856, and it looks basically the same as the lake house did. You see how much variation in color and texture there is in that brick because it was just being made cheap and fast and in a great volume. All the visual interest of the building is coming from things that you'd find inside, or the fact that it was just keeping you warm and keeping you dry. And that's the role that brick played in early Chicago. Wood was cheap, and stone was what you really wanted. People wanted stone. And if you couldn't afford stone and you wanted something more permanent than wood, you were kind of stuck with brick. It was not a material you necessarily wanted, it was just what you had to use. Next slide. For stone, what they wanted was Lamont limestone, this beautiful creamy yellow stone seen in the left image there. But if you couldn't afford that, the first bricks that were being imported to Chicago, the first face bricks, were brought in from Milwaukee specifically because they looked as close to that as possible. On the right there, that's Old St. Pat's Catholic Church on Des Plaines from 1854, and it's covered in what are called cream city bricks, these yellow bricks brought in from Milwaukee, where the clay was finer, more consistent, and very importantly, the brick gave you the sense, the feeling, the color of that more expensive stone if you could not afford it. But around the year of the Great Fire of 1871, a technological revolution, that's what I'm looking for, was occurring, where now machines were being able to produce bricks and grind the clay fine and press it into these molds and then be fired very consistently to produce really the first intentionally made bricks using a machine. Next slide. And those bricks seen here on the old main at IIT are called pressed bricks. And they're prized. They were prized in the height of fashion and popularity in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s because they, for the first time, could be uniform. And you could build a building like this where all the bricks are the exact same color. And because they're being pressed in those molds, they could be laid with these very thin mortar joints. So the whole building looks like it's chiseled out of a single block of stone rather than being made of all these little parts and pieces. Next slide. For decoration, because your brick is all very intentionally the same color, a lot of the decoration comes through shadow, angling the bricks, turning them out to create these lines that trace across the building. Or, like you can see on flanking the window on the right there, do a dog tooth. Or below the window there, a sawtooth is another pattern. But the priority throughout it all is red, the exact same color red as much as possible. Next slide. And the companies that produce this brick, because these molds could press the clay under such pressure to fill every inch, they made special shapes out of the bricks too. And they could treat the brick almost more as if it was cabinetry or molding and woodwork, but in a much more permanent clay. Next slide. And the companies that produced these pressed bricks, they found what people wanted and they just kept making them, made them stock pieces. And so you could order out of a catalog for your brick. So here's the Hydraulic Press Brick Company of St. Louis's, part number 804. There it is on its own, and there it is in a row in Little Italy. And you'll notice the drawing from the catalog is just pen and ink, because that's the assumption. You're going red, nothing else. And the Hydraulic Press Brick Company of St. Louis was a real titan of its age. And a lot of the red brick we see in Chicago was being brought in from St. Louis because that was a place that had a much finer, nicer red clay. Next slide. Another material that enters the market is terracotta. Terracotta is sculpted clay. And the great thing with terracotta is once you sculpt your piece, you can take a plaster cast mold of it and then copy the exact same piece. So this beautiful, unbelievably densely detailed gable here is actually just one piece flipped horizontally. The same sculpture, just flipped. And so it's much cheaper from a sculpting standpoint and from a creating standpoint than if somebody was doing all of that in carved stone. We've seen so much of that uniform red, and so did architects around the turn of the 20th centuries, and they got sick of it. And so they started bringing brickmakers things like watercolors and looking for a more natural, varied looking brick. Next slide. And brickmakers responded with this. This is the 1903 Mandel Brothers warehouse in Boys Town on Halsted. It's got red brick, but then these stripes that cut across it have a lot more color going on. And you'll notice within each brick, too, there are smears of color across it as well. Almost these little, like, dots. The way they achieve that is now, instead of firing the brick carefully, they allow the kiln to have a very naturally occurring variation in temperature and atmosphere throughout the kiln. And as you get that variation in temperature and atmosphere, the brick changes colors in different ways. And then you can also take your bricks and turn them face up and face down and stack them across each other to change how much atmosphere a part of a brick is absorbing. Next slide. So you get bricks like these with these real smears of color across them, where they are intentionally in the kiln stacking the bricks across each other to create these spots and smears and dots. Or the example on the right there from a building I saw in Omaha, Nebraska, where they're actually angling them to create these tiger stripes across the facade. Next slide. Another thing that architects turn to is glazed brick. Glazed brick being made with these much more art glazes, art ceramic style glazes than, what we think of today as your, subway tile, bathroom glaze. This is Hugh Garden's Third Church of Christ Scientist with this beautiful pearlescent blue, where no two are quite identical and they have this wonderful variation in tones. Next slide. Or you can make your glazes with intentional impurities through them, or speckle other colors across the glaze to create a real variation in color, in bricks that look blue or green or yellow, and as you get closer, almost have the feeling of, staring into a galaxy. Next slide. Another variation that enters around the turn of the century is this iron spot brick. And these are bricks made from clay deposits that have an enormous amount of iron impurities in it. And when they're fired, that iron comes to the surface and blisters all across it. And it gives it also this beautiful glassy shine, too. The shine you're seeing off of these bricks, it's not glaze. It is the iron, the metal within the clay that is giving it this almost volcanic look. And architects especially loved iron spot brick because it looked so real and of the earth. Next slide. The most famous appreciator of the iron spot brick seen here is Frank Lloyd Wright, who used iron spot brick on many of the brick homes he designed, including with here, this is the Roby House, which uses a beautiful orange iron spot with these gold and blue and purple specks all across it. Next slide. As architects have been freed from the uniformity of the red, brickmakers are following them. Brickmakers try something new and they start to scrape actually the face of the brick. No longer making it molds, they're now making it through extrusion where the clay is being pushed through a die, a rectangular opening. You get this long log of clay coming out. And they would have a wire that would drag across the brick as it extruded to create this tapestry style brickwork, which is also a trademark name. And this texture you get on the bricks, there's no real reason for it. It is just because it looks interesting and it makes a brick look more like fabric than a building block. Next slide. The best example to see this is Dwight Perkins' 1909 school buildings built 4 times across Chicago, where it is a rough textured a yellow tapestry brick with then this ribbon of gray tracing around it and inset these what they're called soldiers, tall bricks pulled back into the wall, almost like it is stitching brick onto brick, creating this scarf or stole that hangs across the building. Next slide. This tapestry style really comes to define a lot of Chicago's housing. As the city is expanding at such a rapid rate, you get blocks like this in North Austin, these block-sized developments going up all at once where every single building is identical in its layout. But the difference between them, the reason your house looks different from your neighbor's, is because face brick is a different color, red or orange or yellow or purple. And then in this case too, you get these tapestry style white brick decorations sewn into or traced across the face of the building. Next slide. As we get into the 1920s, with this new texture of the brick, brickmakers start to get kind of crazy with it. They see that by making their own bespoke textures, with their own bespoke colors, they could trademark them and corner a market. You know, you can only get this look from this brickmaker. And they push things to really as far as they can possibly go with this immense range of colors and textures, like a bark texture there on the left, or this sort of wandering stick-like texture on the right. Next slide. Architects are also using brick to fill in any and every empty space across a building with brick and pattern. One of the most popular patterns is this diamond you see here, what's called diapering. Diapering comes from a medieval term for a geometric pattern sewn into fabric, which eventually gives its name to the fabric, becomes diaper fabric, and eventually that fabric is used to make baby diapers. That's where baby diapers come from, same place as brick diapers. And you have it on these very fancy, expensive buildings, like on the left there, the Chicago Racquet Club in the Gold Coast, or on the far right, the Aragon Ballroom in Uptown. But in the middle, that's just a storage warehouse in Little Village. It's a windowless building, and so let's cover it with pattern. Next slide. A subset of architects in Chicago, as more and more people are turning towards texture and color, they remember the Chicago common brick, that there is this homemade brick here we have in Chicago that naturally has a very rough and rugged appearance and can make a new building built in a historic style look automatically old. And so you get buildings like this one here in Beverly, but especially across the North Shore suburbs, using Chicago common brick to give your new home a sense of being plucked up out of the European countryside and dropped in. And this one takes it another level by using skintled brickwork, where the bricks are actually pushed out from the wall, and then weeping mortar, where the mortar is allowed to seep over as well. Next slide. This is a crazy one in Flossmoor in the south suburbs, where it's Chicago common brick, but it's got this wave that rolls across the face of the building. Here, there's truly no reason to do this, but it gives this new building a sort of fairy tale style wonder appearance. Next slide. Skyscrapers also embrace brick, even as masonry is not a part of their actual structure. So the Allerton Hotel from 1926, where every blank space is filled in with pattern in brick. In this case, it's called projecting headers. The brick's taken and pushed out from the wall to create this shadow line and this rough, rugged texture across the face of the new building. Next slide. Terracotta has changed a lot as well, and especially as we get into the 1920s with these revival styles, historical styles of architecture becoming more and more prominent. You get almost a feedback loop between terracotta manufacturers and architects for things like the jeweler's building there that is covered so unbelievably densely in detail because it's all terracotta, because you can do it cheaply. You can put these little lion heads or flowers 42 stories up in the air where nobody would see it, but you know it's there. And now they can glaze it with all these different colors and finishes, like this Motor Row building there, to make your building really stand out and be modern for the general public. Next slide. And the terracotta companies produce it in great volume and they make stock pieces and molds. This in particular is the Midland Terracotta Company of Cicero's 4508, that circular piece in the middle there is part number 4508. And you see it all across the city and the suburbs and the Midwest even. And it was designed to have these sort of accoutrements, these modular pieces that could be laid in around it to create whatever decoration you wanted. So you see it in all these different phases and all these different, levels of decoration and design. Next slide. And with the mass production of terracotta and these molds, you will also then get the same buildings almost in their entirety. On the left there is the TA Home building in Oak Park, and on the right is basically the same building, just a one-story version, for a funeral home in Little Rock, Arkansas. Found that in a terracotta company catalog. The Great Depression hits, though, and terracotta, more than anything, cannot recover. Terracotta pretty much disappears after the Great Depression. By 1937, it was at about a tenth of its volume that it had been 10 years before. And when the economy recovers, people don't really want terracotta anymore. They don't want all that historical styling and that decorative detail. What they want is modernism. Next slide. But brick still plays a part in that. And one of the most influential brick architects of this age was actually Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. The great modernist architect was actually a great lover of brick who trained as a bricklayer and made brick an integral part of his campus, using these infill panels of a tan speckled brick. And brick as an integral part of his curriculum, where students were tasked with hand drawing brick, one brick at a time, to create and design an entire house. Next slide. And his students and his apostles really took that idea and that stripped down tan brick style, where the brick really gets out of the way and it gives your eye over to the form of the building. This is 1950s townhome development by Y.C. Wong, a Mies student. Next slide. Other architects, though, set the stage for the mid-century period by using modern forms, but Chicago common brick, the warm, rough Chicago brick, to give this real sense of continuality between outdoor and indoor. This is a really interesting one from 1939 in Blue Island in the south suburbs, designed by Bertrand Goldberg, actually, the architect of Marina City, and these very famous curved buildings. He got to start designing these very boxy modern homes. Next slide. Another great of this era is Paul Schweiker, an architect who built his own house and then architecture studio in Schaumburg, 1939, expanding it in 46. And it's all covered in redwood and Chicago common brick, particular Chicago common brick that was traditionally used for the sewers in Chicago. And he did it on the floors, on the walls, taking that same material from the inside to the outside, looking through these big windows where you can see the material moving continuously, creating very little separation, but still using it because it has so much variation. The walls don't need to be painted because the brick has so much going on. Next slide. And it's this variety of modernism that developers really run with. This is a 1960s ranch in Berwyn, where you can see it's got the brick fireplace, but it's not just a fireplace, the whole wall is brick. And it's the same brick from the outside of the building on the inside of the building. A long, thin Roman brick, and then with lots of wood, taking the same idea of the continuation of the exterior into the interior. Next slide. And in the 60s as well, we start to see glazed brick become a real big decoration and a piece of very intentional choice on a lot of modern buildings. Too much steel and glass feels a little too sterile, and so instead they use things like blue glazed brick walls as a pop of color and advertisement, or on the right there, a apartment building in Des Plaines that has these little glazed brick, almost Tetris-like details, just making it look a little more engaging, a little more visually interesting. Next slide. So this is not a brick, but it's a piece of the end of brick in Chicago. So after the end of the Second World War, labor became the most expensive part of a building. And a common brick is a small unit, and so you need to, one, buy a lot of them to fill in your structural wall, but two, it takes your labor a long time to lay all those bricks too. And so developers and contractors try to find ways to save money on their labor, and they find their solution in concrete blocks, big, heavy cinder blocks that fill up the same amount of space as 7 bricks. And as people start buying more concrete and less brick, companies start to close. Next slide. Like this one we've been seeing here. This is the site of the former Brish Brick Company, founded in 1905, closed in 1963 after there was a fire at the factory, and they really opted not to rebuild, instead letting this clay pit turn over into a marsh that is still there today. Next slide. Another one of these clay pits is the Cary Brick Company, which closed in 1964, but they still own the land, and they had this big pit and a big hill made of broken bricks and trash. And in 1966, Chicago had record snowfalls, and they thought, this is not a hilly location, Chicago. We could make this a ski hill, make this a little ski resort within the city. And so that's what they decided to do. They called it Thunder Mountain. 1967, they opened for their first season, and as you can see on my little graph there, 1967, pretty low snowfall. Not a lot of snow fell. They were really only open for 4 or 5 days the whole winter. It failed, so what'd they do? Next slide. Sold to a developer who made the Brickyard Mall. That's what it is today. The hill's still there. Now, instead of having a chalet on top, it's just a Lowe's. Next slide. The last of the Chicago Common manufacturers shut down in 1981, in large part due to the EPA and the growing environmental movement. The 2 remaining brick manufacturers, the American Brick Company and the Illinois Brick Company, were some of the most polluting brick makers in the entire United States. And they really did not have a way to clean up their operation without spending more money than they had. Now, what they did have was land, and so they started to sell it off. And this is the American Brick Company's Munster plant, the last one shut down. And this here is Clayhole Lake, the old clay pit now filled in with water, slowly being reclaimed on one side for a growing mall development with housing on the other side of those trees there. Next slide. But if you walk around, as I did, and look under your feet, you'll see there's still bricks. It's still bricks everywhere. All the bits and pieces that were made there or cast away or thrown away fill in the earth. Next slide. Now, today you can still buy a Chicago Common brick, and a lot of people do. But it's an old Chicago Common brick taken from a demolished building. Because people, when they build new buildings like these in a multi-million-dollar gated community, they want a new building that looks old, that looks like it has history. And the thing that made Chicago Commons so ugly for so long now makes them so desirable, that sense of character and history. And this picture here is actually not one that I took. I had to hire a photographer to take this for me because this is in Corpus Christi, Texas. That's where these bricks are going. They're going to Texas and Louisiana and Georgia and Florida especially for these new construction buildings. That has been true since the 1960s. And today, instead of paying $10 to buy 1,000 Chicago Common bricks, you're going to pay between $1.30 and $1.60 a brick to buy these bricks, and people happily do it. Next slide. But even though Chicago's no longer producing brick and no longer really using brick as a structural building material, we're still using a lot of brick as a design material, as a decorative material. Like this 1979 Hyatt Regency, the first new masonry construction skyscraper in decades. And it sits sandwiched right there between two Mies buildings, two very modern steel and glass buildings. But the reason they didn't go with steel and glass is because by the 70s and 80s, that steel and glass is a little old-fashioned and feeling slightly sterile and like you're too much on display. And so for homes or hotels like this, brick becomes a way of making it feel homier, making it feel a little more enclosed as a living space. You can be in here and not be on display to the world. It's also great as the energy crisis hits because less glass, less heating, brick is a really good thermal insulator. Next slide. Amongst institutional buildings, we see a huge re-embrace of brick, again, as a rejection of that earlier glass that made buildings that felt too impermanent. You especially see in banks like Independence Bank on the left there, or Savings and Loan on the right from 1975, buildings that are trying to be much more sculptural and heavy and weighty, buildings that feel like they're going to be here forever. You can put your money here because it's not going anywhere. This building is going to be here for 1,000 years with this strength. Next slide. And we see a real full embrace of the brick within what modernism has become. This is the former McDonald's corporate headquarters, now the Hyatt in Oakbrook, where Mies van der Rohe's grandson, Dirk Lohan, covered every single surface of the inside and the outside of this building in this warm, rich, iron-spotted brick. And you've got these walls that turn through the window and stretch far out into the outside. And so your eye is really being dragged from the inside all the way to the outside to help you feel like you're engaging with nature as much as possible. Next slide. But for some people, that feels a little heavy, a little institutional, a little, too stodgy and staid. And so in the 80s and 90s, postmodernism comes about, being more playful with buildings. And there are two ways to do that, two terms for these types of buildings developed by the architects and theorists Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown. And they call buildings either painted sheds or ducks. And this is an example of a painted shed, where this is a very typical office style building, very open plan, lots of windows, flat, but it has this blue glazed brick painted in a way across it with these lozenge shapes. And that's because this was built by El Valor, an organization that serves adults with developmental disabilities. And they want this building to look like an educational space, like a friendly and familiar space. So this is a painted shed. Next slide. And this is a duck. A duck is a building that looks like what it is. This is designed by Carol Ross Barney, built in 1989, and this is the former Glendale Heights post office. And it looks like the American flag. It is waving in the wind, these stripes of red and tan brick, with then a canton in the bottom of blue glazed brick with these punched out windows for stars. And the term duck actually comes from, there was a little roadside stand where you could buy eggs, and it was shaped like a chicken or a duck, because it communicates exactly what it is. Next slide. And this style really is used in a lot of these buildings to create a sense of familiarity and a sort of a safe, secure past. Like this, 1989's Rene Goupil Catholic Church, built down near Midway in a neighborhood that's full of post-war bungalows. The old church was a very modern, boxy little glass and brick building. But by the 80s, they felt that's too officey, that's too old. They wanted a church that looks like a church. And so the architect gave them a church that looks like a church. It's got the familiar red brick with then brown brick painted across it to create these sense of blocks of stone with this big square tower in a very Romanesque inspired building that really could not be anything but a church. Next slide. And housing in Chicago is really transformed by this embrace of a more playful, a more colorful, historically referencing brick. This is the West Haven housing development from the mid 1990s and into the early 2000s. And it was developed by the Chicago Housing Authority to replace the Henry Horner homes. Henry Horner homes, these huge concrete and glass towers surrounded by nothing. This was developed to look very much like a neighborhood. To design it, they actually employed a public relations firm who surveyed residents. And one of the big things they said is they wanted stoops and they wanted bays and they wanted brick. They wanted to have brick. And it is in these soft and friendly colors. Next slide. But as all things do, it starts to feel old-fashioned at a certain point. And the parts of the city that are exciting to homeowners and to developers especially starts to change. From areas like Lincoln Park and Wicker Park with their historic red brick architecture, now to areas like Fulton Market and the West Loop, these much more industrial areas with old factories and canning facilities that are converted into loft buildings. So a lot of new construction is now copying that look. Big rectilinear buildings with lots of windows and these projecting piers. And then the brick itself. It's not the playful reds, oranges, yellows, and soft colors. Now, this is a sleek, black, purpley, bluey, silvery brick. That's whole purpose is to feel and complement metal and glass. The bay windows here are the big feature. The brick is merely this metallic sort of holding shape. Next slide. And so even in areas of the city where there is not or has never been that kind of development, that idea, that black brick, silver brick idea still proliferates. This is a series of 4 new construction homes in Bronzeville that are in their design typical, cottage style buildings. Triangular roof with side door and lots of windows, but they're gray and they're black because that's the idea they're trying to communicate. Hey, you can't afford a Fulton Market townhouse condo, but you can buy this or rent this and get the same open concept kitchen and marble countertops and white walls everywhere. Yeah. This one I also find so interesting because it is right next to, on the right there, a 1990s apartment building with the old style browns and oranges and more playful forms. Next slide. And finally, as architecture moves further and further away from the era in which brick is the structure, we're seeing more and more people playing around with the idea of what a brick can be and using it to create modern buildings that can sit nicely alongside old buildings. So you have on the left there Shuba's Tavern, built in 1903 as a Schlitz tied house. And in 2017, they built Tied House. They call it a restaurant with an event space up above. And it is this brick box with a perforated brick screen to allow light in. But what I really love about it is the shape of that hole in the brick screen. It's not just random, it matches the little red lozenge detail that runs above the window at Shuba's. They just borrowed it and brought it over to the other side. It's also really lovely because it's not just a glass box sitting next to the building. And it makes it so much more interesting from the outside. Next slide. And from the inside. When you're inside, the light is dappling and moving in such interesting ways as the sun moves across the sky. And you get lots of light, you get lots of view outside, but you're not just on display again, and you're not being blasted by light. But finally, you do see the real structure there, a steel lattice work that cuts across. But I love this because it's brick as fabric almost again, but also brick as modern. And it really shows, and I hope you've seen through this presentation, that brick is a lot more than just a brick. It is an intentional design material that has changed and evolved so much through its 3,000 year history of being produced and its 100 and or almost 200-year use in the city of Chicago. It's constantly evolving, it's constantly changing what it is, what it can do, just with the application of a little imagination and a lot of skill and labor. Next slide. Quick plug for my book again. My book is called Fire and Clay: How Bricks Reveal the Hidden History of Chicago. It's published by the University of Chicago Press. And it goes much, much further into all this detail with 102 color photos throughout it. I also got the chance to interview a lot of great architects and historians about their own work designing brick buildings and working on brick buildings to get a real sense, especially for the last 40 years, of how brick has constantly evolved. Talking about, collections, this is not a Chicago collections thing, but part of what I did for the book was went down to the library at the University of Illinois and read every single issue of the Brick and Clay Record, the trade publication for the industry published from 1892 to 1987. But as I mentioned, use a lot of the resources you all make available in your institutions and online to make this possible. So thank you again for that. And last slide, next slide. If you'd like to keep in touch, here's all my contact. I'm at Brick of Chicago online. There's my email, and I give these walking tours. I do walking tours of 12 different neighborhoods across Chicago, covering brick architecture, but also covering the stories of the neighborhoods and the history and the people who live there. And taking this idea of once you can start looking closely at a brick, you can start looking closely and asking questions about anything. And so all of that is on my website. You can see all that there. And once again, thank you so much for having me here today. Love to answer any questions you might have.
All right, well, I'm going to stay on this screen and I'm going to pull up the Q&A very poorly. Okay, so sorry, we got some Q&A throughout. I'm just going to take care of some of them. First question was yes, which I did not say at the beginning. Yes, this program is recorded. So when it's over, everyone who has attended will get the recording and will be on our YouTube page.
I'm seeing the question about would it be possible to add captions, include locations? That's one of the things in my book that I'm most proud of is every single building I mention in the book, I include the address. That is something I find so frustrating in trying to find buildings is when people mention them and don't list the address in all these old sources and hunting around. So yes, in my book I list all the addresses for every building I mention. Let's see. For bricks included iron, can you speak to how much iron was used per brick or batch, and where did local brick companies source their iron using scraps from iron factories in the city? So the cool thing with that is the iron spot bricks. Those again were not being made in Chicago. Those were being made mostly Ohio, Pennsylvania, Nebraska, and Kansas from clay deposits that have a ton of iron pyrite impurities throughout them already. There's no iron being added into that clay. It's all naturally occurring within the brick, which is part of what gives it such a real interesting appearance, is that each brick and each batch is different. So most of the way brick looks is just based on what is in the clay. And Chicago, the clay we got was full of junk, but the clay other places got is full of other things, and it's so hyper local, which I find really interesting. Would you be able to speak to the nuances between the bricks produced from clay pits and brick producers from throughout the Chicagoland region? Can we make informed guesses on the brickyard by looking at the colors or patterns in the common brick? With the common brick, not really. Because it was produced just to be cheap, there was very little done intentionally to make it look any particular way. That said, some of the companies would stamp the bricks with the company name. So if you see a loose one, you can look at it and it might have the name on it. It might say IB Co. is Illinois Brick Co. or Carey or Brish or Bach. But for face bricks, the bricks that go on the fronts of the buildings, those it is possible to be able to look at it and tell who made it. That's especially true of the 20s when they get all that crazy color and texture, because that's the era where brick companies were really um, advertising a lot and making very particular things. Before and after that, it gets harder. That's a case where some of them I recognize because I have seen a loose version of the brick that is stamped on it. Others, like the IIT brick, for example, I can tell you was made by the Hanley Brick Company because I, with permission, took one out of the wall and saw the stamp on it and then got to interview. The company still exists and interview some old salespeople who had stories from the old timers when they started about that brick being made. So your best bet on finding out who made your brick it would be to pull it out of a wall, but I can't always recommend that. Will, what are your thoughts on the painting of old brick homes? I'll answer that part first, and then I'll get to the other one. Don't do it. It's terrible. It's really, really terrible. Brick as a material needs to be able to breathe. It gets wet from the atmosphere, from rain, from water coming down through your parapet or up through the groundwater. But as long as your brick has access to dry air and your mortar has access to dry air, the brick will dry out. It might take a while, it might be slow. But once paint goes on, now it has no access to dry air. And instead of going out, the new dry place for the water to go is in, through your brick wall, into your basement, into your drywall. The other, purely aesthetic thing that is terrible is that it ruins, it strips away all your little brush strokes. I think of bricks as like Van Gogh brush strokes. And if you can remove paint from brick, but it gets really hard, especially if you have a rough texture brick. I just drove by the other day on Grand, a building I'd photographed before that is all the beautiful rug texture, tapestry style brick with contrasting colors, and somebody's turned it into a wedding event center and they painted it all white. And to get it to not look like that anymore will be unbelievably difficult for whoever comes along next. How can I find out what brick was made with your 100-year home? How can I find out where that brick was made and if it was made in Chicago? The common brick that you'll see on the side of the Baxter building was absolutely made in Chicago. That's a case again where you'll see if it has a stamp on it. If it does have a stamp on it, you can reach out to me and ask and give me the name, and I can tell you exactly where it was made and who made it. For the face brick, it's again looking for the stamp and seeing if you can find um, the same thing in some of those catalogs. A lot of those catalogs are digitized on archive.org through various organizations that are preserving historical building guides and things like that. Lane Tech was mentioned. I had no idea this location was tied into the brick trade, as was where WGN Studios is just north of it. That was also a part of the Illinois Brick Company. Can you speak about the brick used in its construction? Yes, it is a rough texture, part of that tapestry era. I believe it specifically is a rug texture brick, where they scrape it in these channels and then smush clay back on to make it look almost like the pile of a rug. And that was very common in that collegiate Gothic style that Lane Tech is. Lane Tech is also, and a lot of the schools are remarkable in that they did use face brick all the way around the whole building. So it is all covered in that same face brick, but right behind it is a lot of that cheap common brick. And then there's a building in my neighborhood. I'd love to further explore the lands. Or there we go. It's mostly light tan or cream brick, but has a band of darker orange or red brick around the bottom. Is there a functional reason for using darker brick at the bottom, or just aesthetic? Is there a style name or a specific time period? It's really just an aesthetic. If I'm picturing it right in my mind, which is a pretty common thing, the first story or the bottom of the first story, they use a different color of brick, and it's a way of sort of treating the building like it is like a column with a base, a shaft, and a capital. And so you have one color of brick as the base. The middle of the building is a different color or pattern, and then if you look up at the very top, I'm guessing what you'll probably see is some other variation. It might be the same brick from the rest of the building used to make corbels where the brick steps out, or some other little pattern that is there just to visually break up the building. Um, Thank you for your email there. I'm going to quick copy that, and I'll shoot you an email. Uh, well, great. Thank you all so much. Oh, here we go. Do you know of any companies doing terracotta repair for houses? My house was built in 1888, and we'd love to try to actually repair it. It's a terracotta repair is an enormous challenge because today there are only two companies in the United States that still make it. Boston Valley in New York and Glen Bean in California, and they do restoration for, skyscrapers. Smaller buildings, the I mean, your best bet is there are companies in England or Italy that will do smaller scale things. Um, but it can be very expensive. It can be very expensive. Um, Other options that a lot of people turn to now is they use different materials like fiberglass reinforced concrete that can be stained to look like terracotta. Um, Shoot me an email if you're interested in exploring it. Am in touch with people who have worked with building owners to restore terracotta and worked with these smaller companies. I'll leave end with one sort of funny story about my role in one of these things. There was a building in Rogers Park that had been built, I believe, as a theater, glazed white brick building with this big, probably 4 foot tall head, face, a woman's face with this purple, green, and gold crown. And somebody bought the building a couple years ago. They didn't like the face, and so they hired somebody to take it off. And they chiseled the terracotta off of the building, and they just threw it away. But it's a red rated landmark building in Chicago, and so they were told, "Oh no, you got to put it back. It it's a landmark building. You can't just do that." And so the terracotta was broken. It was gone. Nothing they could do with that. But I had photographed the building with my telephoto lens to get lots of close-ups on that face a couple weeks earlier, not knowing any of this was going to happen. And my buddy who runs a brickyard was able to then take my photos to a company in Italy, who then used those photos to sculpt a brand new face based on the old face, based on my pictures. So that's a very tangible way I have been able to take part in the preservation of Chicago's buildings.
And we've had a lot of great comments rather than questions, as well as all the great questions. So yes, amazing. I agree. Okay, unless there's anything else for Will, if you have not read Fire and Clay, I totally urge you to. And yes, all the photos are amazing. All the buildings are documented. I loved reading a description, Will, and then realizing I know exactly where that is and turning
Yeah,
and seeing the photo.
perfect. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
And yes, this has been super fun. Thanks for your time. So yes, Will, thank you so much. As I said, recorded. Once we get it back, it'll be sent out to you all who attended, put up on our YouTube page. Please buy Will's book, take his tours. This was so much fun. I said to him before we started, I was sitting on the L this morning, looking at the buildings go by and thinking about brick in a new way. So I think that's what we're all going to do.
I really appreciate it. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.